shortly after Israel bombed the flotilla heading from Tunisia to Gaza, they turned right around and they attacked Qatar in residential areas, attempting to target Hamas officials that had gathered there for diplomacy, for negotiations, and to talk about possible treaties that they might ratify. Now, we're not surprised by this. Israel does this all the time, and they seem to recently love this tactic of waiting for people to gather for diplomatic reasons and then attacking them as they sit at the table trying to negotiate. Now, what's interesting and what is significant, I think, about what this symbolizes, that yes, we expect this type of behavior from Israel generally, but the fact that it is Qatar is quite significant and quite symbolic. That Qatar was one of the first nations to normalize trade relations with Israel, not necessarily the diplomatic relations, but with direct trade in the 90s, Qatar was on the forefront of that. Qatar was also on the forefront of being the host of the U.S. military's presence in the region again in the 90s after the first Gulf War. By the mid-90s, Qatar had built the Al Udeid military base, what is now the largest base in the region, and from the early 2000s onwards has been the home of CENTCOM, of U.S. military activity and coordination in the region. So what this symbolizes is that, if you're going to normalize with Israel, you're going to bend over backwards and become host to the U.S. military. It was done upon the logic that this would, protect you. You would have American support. You would not be a target for Israel. Well, that's out the window. And B, that normalizing in any way, shape, or form was going to bring Israel into certain relations, diplomatic and economic relations, that would force it to behave, force it to play ball, force it to adhere to the international order. All of that is completely scrapped. All of that is completely rendered useless by the recent events. Now, again, there are many that are not surprised by this whatsoever. But it's also interesting as a believer to look into the Quran and see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about situations like this. Who are the people that you shouldn't really bother with treaties, or nations that don't respect anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah At-Tawbah, on the page 188 of the Quran in the Madani Mus'haf, he says, starting at verse 7, he talks about certain nations that just don't play by the rules. They don't respect anything. And he questions in a rhetorical sense why you would have relations or why you would have agreements with such people. He says in verse 8, كَيْفَ وَإِنْ يَظْهَرُوا عَلَيْكُمْ لَا يَرْقُبُوا فِيكُمْ إِلَّا وَلَا ذِمَّةً. He said, how can there be a treaty with such a nation while if they were to gain dominance over you, they don't even observe any pact with you, whether it's a pact of kinship or a covenant of protection. يُرْضُونَكُمْ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ وَتَأْبَى قُلُوبُهُمْ وَأَكْثَرُهُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. Allah says they satisfy you with their words, with what they say, but their hearts refuse compliance. I mean, they're waiting for the second to betray you, and most of them are defiantly disobedient. Certainly, this is the situation with Israel, a nation that glories in its arrogance and glories in breaking every single ceasefire, every single agreement, every single treaty that comes about. So for those who are still on the fence about, normalization, and I know some people have called normalizing ties with Israel as the, the economic colonization of Israel, or imagine they're playing some 4D chess, just go back to the Quran. Just go back to the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pointed these things out, that with nations that don't respect any rules, they only respond to one language, and that is the language of resistance and the language of force. We wish it weren't that way. We wish we could settle it at the negotiation table, but this is the path that they've chosen for themselves. So for all the other nations in the area that have gone down the pipeline of normalization, Morocco and Saudi and of course the Emirates and Bahrain and all of them, they should all be shaking in their boots right now. That it doesn't matter how much you normalize with Israel, you're not going to be safe.